Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for joining me on this lovely Friday. Great show to end off the week. As always, it's Implications Day, and you know what that means. We're talking about in both the NFL and college football, the biggest games in terms of fantasy implications and stakes. I'm also going to be previewing Sunday Night Football a little bit. We never really get the chance to over the weekend since we don't extend our show into the weekend, so I do want to get ahead of the curve there and preview what should be an interesting game on Sunday Night Football, and also in terms of fantasy, give you a start-sit segment there as well. And then for my final segment today, I'm going to introduce a new segment, my Fact versus Fiction segment, in which I either shed light on a bold fantasy take that I came up with myself or debunk it. So I thought it would be very interesting. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. But speaking of which, before we get into today's show, if you want to kind of contribute and interact with the channel more extensively, consider liking, following, and subscribing to not just my show, but the network as a whole. It also supports me and my fellow podcasters because it's a great way to get involved and watch more content such as this. But if you want to interact with the show more directly, including other shows around the network, consider using the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. It is greatly appreciated. I want to hear all your opinions about what I have to say on the show, or what you have to say. Your input yourself really makes the show that much better. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's show and end off the week with a bang here. And we start off with our first segment being the NFL games, the biggest fantasy implication. I always try to find 4 good games, but it was pretty easy this week because the weekend slate is just a crazy mashup of incredible matchups that we're getting here. It's a treat to talk about this weekend in the NFL. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with the first game that I want to touch upon, Ravens Bucks, the flexed Monday night game, which my dad is mad about because he's a Vikings fan. He wanted the Lions and the Vikings to be flexed Monday night, but I really am happy that this is the Monday night game because it's such a bizarre intra-conference game, if you get what I'm saying. It's, like I said when I talked about this game a little earlier in the week, a Ravens offense that's really operating at a high level, perhaps the highest in the AFC, a huge threat to contend, make a deep playoff run, and then the Bucks, who just had this mojo and swagger about them, led by Baker Mayfield and his connections with guys like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, supplemented by a very physical, very gritty run game with Bucky Irving leading the way. That really makes it an interesting matchup. But the reason why this is such a interesting narrative here, not just what I put on my screen here, is saying that there's a lot of weapons to choose from a fantasy perspective. I think that the underdog skill position players will be much better. I think the Bucks will lose this game as the underdog here, but at the end of the day, you're still picking guys like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin in your fantasy lineups. It's not like we're indicting them just because they're going up against the Ravens. And not for nothing, the Ravens, yes, they're an interesting fantasy team because of the value that both Lamar and Derrick Henry add to this team. We both know that they are going to perform very well fantasy-wise. When we think about Lamar as a passer, and we think about the weapons he has at disposal, I do like Likely, but at the end of the day, Lamar's decision-making, outside structure, when he's not, utilizing design runs, not necessarily utilizing his legs, maybe more as a pocket passer, is more tailored to decision-making based on what he sees of the defense than favoritism of, say, a certain receiver. So while there are superstar-level players at the skill positions for Baltimore, I don't necessarily know they're as effective as fantasy prospects as the Bucks are. And that's why, even though the Ravens still have so much fantasy value just because of what Lamar and Derrick Henry does, I think that we're going to get more of a heavy dosage of them than anyone else on this Ravens roster. And not for nothing, I still do like Isaiah Likely a heck of a lot because of the value he's added in elevating his game to become a better pass catcher than we expected this season. But I still feel like on the Bucs side of things, you just have so many players who you're confident in, like Mike Evans, who on any given week is a wide receiver 1, and then Chris Godwin is a serviceable wide receiver 2 for you, and even Baker Mayfield at the quarterback position. My personal fantasy quarterback starter is someone who can get you valuable points and valuable production. So at the end of the day, that's why this game is so intriguing outside of the whole narrative of the Ravens offense. Because the Bucs offense, let's not forget, is also very potent. I believe they're tied with the Commanders for the most points scored in the NFL thus far. And not for nothing, they've had some good wins. Yes, I feel like the Ravens are deservedly the favorites in this game, but don't count out the Bucs offense because you never really can from a fantasy perspective. So look out for this game on Monday night to be a good one. The second game I want to touch upon, Super Bowl rematch, Chiefs, 49ers. And it definitely has a different flavor than last season's because not all of the big players are going to be in this game. But at the end of the day, the reason why it's still intriguing from a fantasy perspective is because of how we've now viewed these teams, knowing the injury histories they've had this season. For the Chiefs side of things, we know how valuable Rashee Rice was at the wide receiver position, but now we also know that perhaps the Chiefs aren't necessarily founded upon being solid fantasy production players. They're definitely very deep, and we were really expectant of players like Worthy and Kelsey to step up. But I don't think that's the case for a team like the Chiefs. I think they're content to, distribute the wealth, kind of cross the bridges once they get to them, and just find a way to win football games. And fantasy football managers might not like that, but if it's winning football, then the Chiefs won't mind at all because that's what they want to do. On the 49ers side of things, there's been some revelation here for these kind of backup role players for the 49ers. We've seen good performances out of Jordan Mason. We've seen semi-good performances out of Jawan Jennings when he's needed to step up. But at the end of the day, I feel like when all the health for the 49ers, all the players who were injured come back to the 49ers, I feel like a lot of the excitement about the depth of the 49ers gets called into question because everyone knows that a fully healthy 49ers team gives you a lot of fantasy value. A healthy McCaffrey, a healthy Samuel, a healthy Kittle. It's like a well of talent that you can choose from if you're a fantasy football manager. But at the end of the day, what it ultimately comes down to is the fact that how do you then assess guys like Mason and Jennings in terms of whether or not you want to sell them high while the market's still hot for them, or think of them highly enough that they remain on your team potentially now as just a flex or RB2 in the case of Mason or wide receiver 2 in the case of Jennings for the time being. So this game really comes down to who you value yourself in terms of how these teams utilize all their players. Because if you have the backups for the 49ers, let's say, the Masons and Jennings of the world, you're hoping that the magic carpet ride for them doesn't end anytime soon and that they're still significant contributors. But if, say, you're a McCaffrey or a Samuel or Kittle owner, you're anxious to get them going to ramp up by the time the fantasy playoffs come. So this one, for both teams, really is one I'm going to be monitoring in terms of how I look at certain players on both sides in terms of their value, whether it's plummeting or skyrocketing, because That's what I want to see out of two teams with hefty injury histories right now. Then the third game I want to talk about, Texans versus Packers. Like I put here, this one is kind of to determine the real Super Bowl hopeful in their respective conferences, because both of them have high aspirations, but a lot of questions concerning whether or not they can actually meet them. So, the Texans side of things, in terms of a fantasy perspective, we know the drill. This is another team that, not necessarily ravaged by injuries, but the loss of Nico Collins was expected to be significant, but in their last game against the Patriots, they ran roughshod over them, absolutely annihilated them, but it was the Patriots. Now against the Packers, I feel like the Texans' strengths here will stem from C.J. Stroud's abilities to elevate his receiving core, and thus every single one of the wide receivers, or even a guy like Dalton Schultz, will be elevated. Guys like Diggs, guys like Dell, they're all going to be in the picture for you this weekend in fantasy, because on the Packers side of things, I don't trust this defense as much because of the fact that they rely too much on the takeaway. But on the offensive side of the football, there's a lot of weapons to choose from as well for the Packers. And maybe that's the concern for some people, that you never know which Packers wide receiver is going to be the best on any given Sunday. But that's kind of the excitement of it, because what with a guy in Jordan Love who's willing to distribute the wealth in this offense, I feel like you have to roll with the punches a little bit, because the Packers are just so valuable. You know how good their offense can be, and whether it's Reed, Dobbs, Wicks, Kraft you have in your lineup, you have to hope that at least some portion of the game will play into their advantages, because you can have so many different game plans if you're the Packers, and that's what I'm excited to see. But overall, very interesting game in terms of the weapons that both respective quarterbacks have at their disposal and how they'll utilize them, and how, a defense that a lot of people might have liked in fantasy might be exposed a little bit because of the fact that they're too over-reliant on the takeaway. And the last game I want to highlight here before we take a quick break, of course, Lions-Vikings, perhaps the game of the week in a divisional sense between two teams, one kind of a surprise, the other we know to be a NFC juggernaut going up against each other. And this game, I feel like, can prove that Minnesota will have a say in the NFC North race this season, but I want to see the Vikings defense, most importantly, in this game. I think they're the biggest player, actually, from a fantasy perspective. Even in a game with guys like Justin Jefferson on the Vikings side of things, and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta, and even David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs on the Lions side of things, I want to see this defensive unit for the Minnesota Vikings face an offense with so much verbiage, so many different varieties and styles of how they can play and how they can beat you, really stand up to them, to prove to me that they're contenders in the NFC North. And I think very highly of this Vikings defense either way, whether they get blown out or whether they keep the game close. What I really want to see is if the first couple of weeks were simply a mirage or simply an example of things to come. Because if it's an example of things to come, then we might be thinking about the Minnesota Vikings and not just NFC contenders, perhaps Super Bowl contenders, with how well that defense is playing. That's the key for me. But let me know what you think in the comments. But that will just about do it for our first segment of the day. Coming up next, we're going to be transitioning to the world of college football, talking about the games in the world of college football with huge implications, a lot in both the SEC and the Big Ten. So you definitely don't want to miss it after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit, I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant, I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you want to interact with the show throughout any given episode, keep on using the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. Great way to interact with the show. You can press the $ on your screen to leave a tip or donation, or just leave a question, comment, or concern on anything I talk about in this show, as Andre himself enters the chat. Always one of my favorite commenters of the day, of any week, and of all time, as this show has been live. But without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of the day, taking a little bit of a break from NFL talk to talk about college football. Doing the same exact thing, talking about the biggest games, and there are a lot this weekend in college football with the hugest fantasy college football implications. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. And we all know which game I'm going to talk about first. Texas, Georgia. Oops, wrong graphic, but Texas, Georgia. And this isn't just about the QB battle, right? It's not just Beck versus Ewers. It's about the skill position players that both of them have. Now, a lot of people are saying that Quinn coming into this game is looking a bit rusty after his first start at coming back from the oblique injury, and, you know, facing a defense like Oklahoma's and all the complications that could come. But he did settle down, and he did have a rather decent game. Nothing too extraordinary. But on the other side of the equation, Carson Beck is someone who puts up gaudy numbers, but still has some concerning moments as well. As Andre said, I look for a big game from ETN against Texas. And I'm going to get to their skill position. As Andre said, is this game in Texas or Georgia? It is in Texas, in Austin. So it should be an incredible atmosphere here. But here's the thing about what I set up with the skill position players. And you're right in bringing up a guy like ETN. If the storyline doesn't center around the quarterback, so we'll have to center around two different position groups here. For Georgia, I think the running backs are going to be called into question here just because they haven't been as good as we thought, and Texas' run defense is perhaps the best in the nation. So I will say the running backs are 1A, but the perimeter players, the perimeter wide receivers specifically, for Georgia need to create separation, because the Texas secondary is perhaps the only real sign of apprehension Texas fans will have about this team thus far. I don't think they will be as tested for what Georgia can bring downfield because they haven't seen anything quite like it yet this season. So look for Georgia's perimeter receivers. I'm looking at guys like Bell, maybe Lovett as well, to contribute a lot in this game. But Andre, you are right in saying that Trevor Etienne will also have a big game, because if he can't get going against Texas' run D, then Carson Beck might be in for a rough game if they don't get anything going on the ground. On the Texas side of things, I think the same. I think the running backs will also have a big say. Look out for Quintravion Wisner. He had a slow start to start the season, but over the past couple of games, I believe he's had 206 yards rushing, including a career-high 118 last week. So look for him to be someone who is an X factor in this game, can calm Quinn down if some of that rustiness is showing early. But I also like the perimeter weapons that Texas has. I think if Bond is healthy enough to look 100% himself, he's a big factor. Gunnar Helm is going to be a big factor, especially in the red zone. I think, for Texas. And also, I really like what Ryan Wingo can do in terms of touching the field. Quinn hasn't shown the propensity this season to hit many deep balls, but if he gets an opportunity, like he did the last time he was in a game of this magnitude against Bama, he's going to take his shots. So look for Wisner, Wingo, and Helm to be the X factors in this game, also from a fantasy perspective. But it's going to be a good one. I'm really excited as a Longhorns fan for this one. The second game I want to talk about here is Nebraska-Indiana, actually. And this is a very weird one as well because it's heavily contingent, as Andre said, Quinn hit the Costco guys dance. I did, in fact, see that, and that brought a smile to my face because I love Quinn's touchdown celebrations because he always cracks me up for what he does. But going into Nebraska-Indiana, speaking of celebrations and speaking of players who, as a Quinn fan, some people might get annoyed by him, but I like him. But Dylan Raiola is definitely annoying a lot of people in terms of his Patrick Mahomes. I understand Indiana are going to smoke them. I'm calling it. I could see it. I could definitely see Indiana winning this game and handily. And credit to Kurt Cignati for bringing in all these transfer portal guys like Quarter says. The Raiola hype has died down a lot. Chris, what's happened to them? I mean, I just think that, this whole act that he brings is just distracting for what Nebraska wants to do, because the winner of this game, let's face it, is going to be a Big Ten player. But at the end of the day, Raiola is someone who is just perhaps a little too distracted to really put out a nice product on the field week in, week out. And so against a team that itself is looking to have shocking Big Ten title aspirations, you can't slip up. And that's why I feel like Indiana has all the momentum here. I love Curtis Rourke. He could be a dark horse Heisman candidate. I love their weapons. I love their defense. It's very physical. So in this game, it is going to come down to the quarterbacks a little bit more, but I do think Indiana's depth matters here because Dylan Raiola can be his Mahomes-esque self, but at the end of the day, if it's a distracting thing to the product you put out on the football field, your chances are you're going to get blown out by teams that actually want to compete for titles. And Indiana certainly feels like one that could shockingly do so. So that's why I feel like the QB battle in this game is highly integral to the outcome. But you could be exactly right when you're saying Indiana could smoke them, because this game could get ugly quickly if Raiola is not in his game. So you could be very right there. The third game, actually, I want to talk about, Alabama-Tennessee. Kind of taking the back seat to Texas-Georgia this week. On any given week, this would be the main attraction. It still kind of is, because this is a rivalry where Alabama has dominated the past couple of years. But Tennessee, of course, had a big win, I believe, 2 years ago at Neyland Stadium. This time back in Knoxville. And it kind of has a different flavor a little bit, because Tennessee, I feel like at the start of the season, there was a lot of hype around them because Nico looked good. And he looked like he was going to be someone who could lead Tennessee as a true freshman, an admirable job to the college football playoff. But then, about 2 weeks or so ago, Heupel decided perhaps that he doesn't trust him as much as he trusts his defense. And trust me, Tennessee's defense rivals that of Texas's as one of the best in the nation. And yes, I can see why Heupel might want to lean into the physicality that a good defense can bring to a team and the grittiness of how you want to play the game. But at the end of the day, if the offense can't put up points, what's the point of having a good defense? Because you need to trust both sides of the football if you want to be a CFP contender. And right now it doesn't feel like Tennessee. Whereas Alabama is kind of the opposite, right? I feel like they trust their offense a little bit too much, right? In terms of, quote unquote, figuring things out. But then we see these lapses where Alabama's defense lets it down. And let's be honest with you. That game against Georgia could have had a different tune if, the offense didn't jump out to an early lead. And that's the weirdness of the Alabama Crimson Tide this season. Are we going to see the Alabama offense have a consistent game, right? Like, say, the one they had against Georgia, where they matched them point for point? Or will the Alabama offense be more like we saw with Vanderbilt and South Carolina this past week, where it's kind of two stop-start to really get going? And so I really don't know how much weight I can place on the value of certain players for Alabama and for Tennessee, for that matter, if I don't know the direction either of these teams is going. Because both of them have distinct strengths. Both of them have exceptionally glaring weaknesses that can be exposed by anyone on any given Saturday. And so I want to see some consistency. As I said, the Tennessee offense looks so stagnant these past few weeks. They need to step up here. And I completely agree. Something has to give for one of these units, whether it be Bama's defense or Tennessee's offense. As Andre said, the defense will get them stops though 100%, and I agree with that. But it's going to come down to the Tennessee offense and the Alabama defense. Which unit is going to have a good enough game to get a very important win, to keep the winner in the CFP race, most importantly. And that's the true narrative here that I'm trying to get at. And then the last game that I kind of want to touch on, a little bit of a weird one. Oklahoma State versus BYU. At the start of the year, you probably would have been sitting here going, Chris, what is the meaning of this game? Why is it such an important game, especially from a fantasy perspective? I'll tell you why. Because interestingly enough, BYU is a more appealing fantasy team if you are a fantasy college football player right now than Oklahoma State. And that sentence probably would have never even been considered being spoken into existence before the season start. Because Oklahoma State, you had Ollie Gordon, you had a really nice skill position group led by Brendan Presley. You had a 7th-year senior quarterback in Alan Bowman who, no matter how erratic he is, still can put up good games. And not for nothing, they still had good stretches, but Ollie Gordon has fallen off the face of the earth. He perhaps was the most exciting fantasy college football prospect. Maybe if you were, say, an NFL fantasy football player and you're looking at a dynasty league setting, he had a lot of promise there as well. So his future drastically changed in terms of a fantasy perspective and in real life. Whereas BYU had a couple of decent players, but no one really that could have projected to lead a 6-0 start and be a contender in the Big 12. I mean, I like Jake Retzlaff a little bit, but not enough to convince me that he would have BYU in the driver's seat of the Big 12 title race right now. And not for nothing, his weapons, whether it be Lassiter, whether it be Marion, whether it be Chase Roberts, all of them have contributed well enough to carry this BYU team to contender status, at least in the Big 12, because in the CFP, let's be real, I don't think they'll have a fighting chance. But point is, the narrative has shifted for both of these teams in real life and from a fantasy perspective. And the question is, well, how much fantasy value are you going to place in this game, if any? Because both of these teams are great fantasy teams, but one of them is disappointing at this point in time, and the other is a complete and utter surprise. So that's why I just wanted to bring this to attention. Another game that I wanted to pinpoint, Miami-Louisville. Cam Ward might just be the best option for fantasy college football managers everywhere at the QB position. He's just a magic man. Whereas Louisville can spring a surprise. Tyler Schaaf's been around in college football for quite some time. But at the end of the day, I think that Cam Ward and that receiving crew is too tough to deny in a fantasy perspective. Let me know what you think in the comments. Coming up next, though, we are transitioning back to the NFL, specifically to the Sunday night game. Very weird one now, with all the storylines we've heard about these two teams. So you don't want to miss it. It's going to be a good one right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Sorry about that slip up. But for our third segment of the day here on the show, we're going to be talking all things Sunday Night Football. And what a weird game this is looking to be. A lot of different storylines to touch upon here, but we do have to look at it from a betting perspective first. Without further ado, let's talk about the New York Jets versus Pittsburgh Steelers matchup set for Sunday Night Football. The Jets are a 2-point favorite, and I think rightfully so. I think they are the better team in this matchup. Over-under, shockingly low, one at 38.5. Pittsburgh's at plus 110 to win this game, and the New York Jets are at minus 130. Now, the thing about this game is that narratives aside, storylines aside, who could start and who could potentially not, all of that aside, when I look at this matchup, this is a game of equal importance to both of these teams, but one of them is going to take it much more seriously, almost to the point of exaggeration to win this game. As Andre said, Najee should have a good game, I think. Kind of jumping the gun here talking about Najee Harris, but I do have him in my stardom sit-in segment that I don't necessarily want to spoil too much of it because it definitely has had a couple changes in the past couple of minutes because of what I had to consider now that we're hearing all of these rumors. But I do think that Najee will have a good game, and I think he could be a potential starter in your fantasy league this week. But looking at this game from a broader perspective here, I feel like the Jets right now are too stuck in the mindset of handing Aaron Rodgers the keys to the car that it could lead to a total and utter mess that I can't predict. A lot of people, for some reason, getting caught up in this Devontae Adams trade. But let me tell you, getting caught up in it doesn't necessarily mean, as Drew Griego says, has anyone heard anything about Georgia Tech's quarterback? Is he out for sure? Let me check for you, my man, because Haynes King is someone who I highly respect in terms of college football circles, highly underrated fantasy quarterback as well. He does look like he will be out for this game against Notre Dame. Thank you for this heads up. It does say day-to-day, but it does look like he will be out, and their backup, Zach Pyron, will start that game. But as Drew Griego said, combing all Sports betting chats to find out, although I can update you right now to say that he is, and definitely changes the tenor of that game. Notre Dame, Georgia Tech could be out as well. But Andre as well, throwing in a little bit of a comment here. Do you think they are making a mistake starting Russ? I don't think it's that bad, TBH. Let's talk about that first, because I was going to talk about the Jets a little bit first and all their hectic craziness, but let's get into the Steelers as well, because they're just as crazy. Announcing Russ as the starter for this game, I don't necessarily know if it's going to be a mistake, because at this point in his career, when I look at him compared to Justin Fields, they're about the same thing. As Guido said, good to know. As Splash also says, Aaron Rodgers, Jets GM, head coach, and starting QB will throw 2 picks. That's kind of a jokey comment there. But let's start off with the Steelers, and then we can get to the Jets and how weirdly they are being run right now. Because Andre makes an interesting point here in his question. I don't necessarily know if it will be a mistake, but I don't know if it's the right decision. Because, like I said, I view Russell Wilson and Justin Fields in similar ways. Russ, is not the same quarterback like he was in the latter stages of his career in Seattle. And I do think that he's looking for a more methodical approach to his game. Whereas Justin Fields adds a little bit more excitement from a future upside in terms of his youth. But I don't know if the Steelers want to be all in on this season if he was the answer going forward. So I don't know if it's a mistake, but this is certainly not a team that I feel like Russell Wilson will be fully comfortable on. I do like the actual QB head coach pairing with him and Mike Tomlin. I do think that could work out, but we're going to have to see what the results are like on the field. So, in that case, though, let's take a look at what this means for the skill position players, because if Russ still has the deep ball in him, and it's still an effective part of his game, then George Pickens could become a value again from a fantasy perspective. And Pat Freiermuth is a quarterback's best friend as well, because he's always one of those guys who can exploit the soft spots. And not for nothing, I do think that the Jets secondary has been a little bit lax this season. So look for Russ to look a little bit more methodical than we've seen him in recent memory, but still kind of benefit from a more calm down, quick pass approach to his game. And like Andre also pointed out, it could help Najee Harris as well. It could factor a little bit more into their offensive attack and be of use earlier in certain downs. Now let's go to the Jets, because as Flashpoint brings up, anyone can throw interceptions in this team because we don't know who is the head honcho there anymore. I think they've lost the plot in terms of how this organization is structured, how the hierarchy looks, and most importantly, how morally they're going to look moving forward. Because if you really want to sell out for Aaron Rodgers, I don't think you should do it to throw away the talent you have on this team. Because right now, the Davante Adams trade sits worse and worse in my mind as the days go by. Because as happy as Aaron Rodgers is, and as happy as Davante Adams is, and as happy as, the Jets organization is with getting a guy like Davante Adams, you are really neglecting the foundation of the team you are building here. I think it's an affront. I will continue to say this for as long as the Jets are either inept or as long as potentially Davante Adams with this team. It's an affront to Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, who exceeded expectations with worse help around them. So, I don't know where the Jets go from here. As Andre also said, I'm shocked Garrett Wilson's receiving line is higher than Tay Adams. I'm not surprised, just because the media and Vegas will fall in love with Tay Adams just because of the whole Rodgers narrative. But I just think that either way, it's kind of to Garrett Wilson's detriment. Just because, everyone's now going to think of Davante Adams as the bright spot in this team, when in fact Garrett Wilson always was from the moment he donned a Jets uniform. So we're going to see as the season goes on more respect being put on Adams than Garrett Wilson, when in fact I feel it should be the other way around. Now, how it will affect this game and how you bet, I definitely feel like, as Andre is kind of alluding to here, if you're betting the Jets, especially in that wide receiver room, I feel like it's going to come down to whether or not you think Adams can add that value right away. Because make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, Rodgers will be insistent on making him the focal point of this offense. And he's going to get a lot of targets. He's going to get a lot of catches. And as the season goes on, he's just going to be the guy that Aaron Rodgers wanted to have all along. But if you still have hope for guys like Wilson and Hall, chances are the Jets still have a little seed of thought where potentially Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson will still have important supplementary roles, because you can't just completely throw them by the wayside just so that Rodgers and Adams can play buddy-buddy. So look for while some betting lines for them might not be as appealing as others as the season goes on, look for them to still be consistently guys who you might want to bet on and bet the over on in more cases, more often than not. Because I still think they add a lot of value to this team. But overall, in terms of my personal pick, I have to pick the Jets just because they simply have more talent, and I think the Pittsburgh Steelers were a little too rash in benching Justin Fields. Now, maybe, he should have gotten the hook a little bit sooner, and it feels not necessarily abrupt, but a little bit, weird to have a winning record and switch quarterbacks. And that's a point of contention here at GSMC when we do our production meetings. The question of whether or not Justin Fields got the hook too soon or whether or not he should have even started in the first place. But all those questions about the Steelers are a little too sketchy right now. And the Jets are still sketchy as well. And I'll continue to kind of rant about them for as long as, Devontae Adams is with the team. And I'll always say that because it doesn't sit right with me, this trade. But at the end of the day, I still think the Jets overwhelmingly have more talent, and eventually they'll figure out what to do with it. Hopefully. Because if you're a Jets fan, you kind of have to worry about this Rodgers-Adams relationship and how it can lead to more tension with an already somewhat dissatisfied Garrett Wilson, with an already somewhat dissatisfied Breece Hall. And I'm just spitballing. I don't know if they're completely dissatisfied themselves in the way they carry themselves with this team, but you have to at least acknowledge what could be happening in their minds right now, seeing Devontae Adams walk through the door. So, overall, if I'm a bettor, I would stay away, as honest at LMAO can see Boswell with 3 to 4 field goals this game. Maybe he might just be the best fantasy option for the Steelers in this game, because Chris Boswell is always a consistent kicker. That's all I can really say about him. And he's just someone who, at the end of the day, is almost like a wide receiver too at the kicker position. I love saying that about certain kickers. I have my certain kickers who I always say they're worth a lot more than they seem like guys like not just Boswell, Koo maybe. You can throw in, say, Lutz. Had a great game last night. So there are kickers out there who I like valuing more highly than they probably should be. But Chris Boswell, I might be even talking about this a little bit more in my start to sit him segment coming up next. So, he's an interesting kind of player. So, look for this game to kind of start a little bit slowly and expect the Jets to maybe ramp up as it goes on. But ultimately, I still think they're the favorites here. And not for nothing, I still think that the Steelers are in too weird of a spot right now to have made this decision this quickly to start Russ. And that's all I can really say about the Steelers. But coming up on the other side, letting me know what you think in the comments about this game as well. But coming up after this short break, we'll be talking a little bit more about the start-sit options for this game. I'm going to have to change a lot of what I had written down initially, but we're going to do it off the cuff. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show thus far. We're going to be sticking a little bit with this Sunday night football game. A little bit of start-sit advice now. Fair word of warning. You might have to bear with me here because I wrote all of my start-sit options for this game much earlier in the week. And hearing all the news throughout the week about both of these teams, I wasn't expecting to be sitting here a little bit blank in terms of how I might have to change up my tune a little bit here. But we're going to be doing this off the cuff, and let's just start off with the two players kind of contention who kind of got me into this mess. As Anna said, he's off to a crazy start in fantasy this week, getting 48 points from Broncos defense and Javonte Williams, LMAO. I expected the Broncos to win this game, right? But I didn't expect them to play as handily as he also said. He still has King Henry, Josh Allen, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase to play. Well, look for historically good numbers from you this week, my man. I think you're all set to have potentially 200-point game this weekend. So I'm really excited for you. But let's get into the weirdness of some people who might still be on the fence about who to start, especially those with players in this game, because I really don't know. And like I said, I'm going to have to start off with the two players who got me into this mess in the first place. On the Jets side of things, Davante Adams. On the Steelers side of things, as Russell Wilson. I mean, here's the thing. I'll love to say that you can start Davante Adams immediately. I'll love to say his status and upside immediately skyrockets in this game. I don't think it's going to be the case, A, because, he still has that hamstring injury to consider, and, as much as the Jets might want him to rush back, he's not going to look as good right away. And I kind of want to see one more game where Aaron Rodgers works with the weapons he already has. Not for nothing, I felt like that game against Buffalo did have a lot of interesting things in there that proved to me that Rodgers can incorporate Wilson and Hall, but it was still too, quote-unquote, Lazard-centric, if you know what I mean. And then, not for nothing, I kind of feel like the Steelers' defense is a weird defense to kind of push someone against right away in their first start for a team. So I kind of feel like Davante Adams is an easy sit. Not necessarily an easy sit, but a sit in my mind. And then Russell Wilson, I might feel like in a deeper league, he could be a sneaky option at the quarterback position. I don't necessarily know what to expect from him. This is like his first start in quite some time. But if he buys into the Steelers' culture, it will really pay dividends for him. Because he just needs to find a culture for him that settles him down to the point where he's not as insistent on certain traits of his game. I don't expect to see him run the ball as much. I don't want to see him throw the deep ball that much. So in this game, I'm really looking for him to be more methodical, more calm, more poised. And not for nothing, I feel like the Steelers will be ready to help him with that progress in his career. So look for him to potentially be sneaky start here. But now I'm going to have to rejigger a little bit. Where initially I said Breece Hall was an instant start, I'm kind of on the fence about him now. Because I do feel like the Jets need a run game to even think about incorporating Adams as much as they want to. But at the end of the day, I kind of feel like they are selling out to allow Aaron Rodgers to let loose here. But I still think Breece Hall has a lot of upside. I still think just because, he's so good in the receiving game and such a physical runner who can really have a great offensive output for you. I'm on the fence about him. And I'll ultimately leave it up to Breece Hall owners to interpret that because I really can't say if I would start him knowing where the Jets' offense is projecting to go. And then as well as Braylon Allen, who really right now is kind of feeling hard done by because he was the guy who was getting a lot of touches in the run game as well. And now, who knows what the run game will look like for the Jets. And then I said sit Garrett Wilson. I'm going to stick with that one just because. And I personally this week did choose to sit him. And it felt a little weird because the guy who I'm bringing him to replace him is a rookie on a terrible team in Xavier Legette. But I felt like I at least needed to do something to kind of project how I feel about Garrett Wilson. And it's through no fault of his own. I consider him highly in this Jets offense, but it's a situation where you're kind of maddened by how he's being let down by this organization. But then the player like Mike Williams for the Jets, he is really now a wild card here. Because if you look at this receiving core, it's really deep. You have Garrett Wilson, who should still, in my opinion, be the wide receiver 1, but ultimately is falling to the wide receiver 2. You now have Devontae Adams. You have Lazard, who is already working wonders with Aaron Rodgers this season. And then you have Mike Williams, who out of all of them might be the guy that, as Andre said, the trade just felt like a slap in the face. I had to trade Garrett Wilson immediately. It's not your fault. It's not his fault. And it's not anyone who decides to start or sit him's fault. It's just that the Jets are really a little bit too stuck in the Aaron Rodgers world. And I don't know if they'll ever get out of it. And if they don't, it's going to leave a dark stamp on the history of this Jets team in this Pacific era in the future. For a lot of Jets fans, it's going to leave a bad taste in their mouth, and it's not going to feel good talking about a player like Garrett Wilson, talking about a player like Breece Hall when it's all said and done. That's just my opinion. Let me know what you think about that opinion in the comments, or if you have your own. But I do think that it feels highly uncomfortable now having to either sit or trade away Garrett Wilson in your fantasy league after having such high hopes for him this season. But in terms of Mike Williams, right, I actually think that of all these receivers, he might be the one Aaron Rodgers' play style suits the most. I love him a lot as a kind of prototypical, quote-unquote, Aaron Rodgers kind of receiver. He's someone who can really be potentially a breakout star for this team. Now, Adams is going to get a lot of attention, so it's going to leave room for, as Andre kind of alluded to a couple days ago with the whole Garrett Wilson situation, going to lead to more opportunities potentially underneath for guys like Wilson and then Mike Williams, who, not for nothing, is not only a solid route runner, but can extend the field. He can be the deep threat that the Jets could utilize to a certain effect if the run game's any good going forward. But at the end of the day, I feel like Mike Williams is now someone who was seen as an afterthought for the Jets, but could now potentially be their wild card and X factor moving forward. So I think he could be a potential start in any fantasy medium going forward, not just this game. On the Steelers side of things, I interestingly enough said to start Justin Fields, but look where that has ended up with me for this week. So, yeah, Russell Wilson, not for nothing, man. I appreciate all you've done for the Steelers, but you truly messed up my segment when it came to talking about starting and sitting the Pittsburgh Steelers here. And then I was thinking about the Steelers skill positions, right? And I was thinking about guys like Freiermuth and Pickens in this game, and thinking about the matchups for them. And I was saying to sit them, but now both of Pickens and Freiermuth, now that Wilson is the starter, potentially could see their best traits utilized to the best of their abilities. As Andre's asking me what my Pacific fantasy lineup is for this week. And I will pull it up here because I myself had to make a lot of drastic changes this week as well. Without further ado, this week I am behind a little bit. The other guy who I'm facing had Alvin Kamara, who fortunately enough had a pretty bad game, and now I'm favored in my matchup. I have Baker as my starting QB. James Cook is my running back. We'll see how he looks, if he's even back in this game against Tennessee. DeAndre Swift is on a bye week, and I don't really have a backup running back I trust, so I'll let that slide. And then my wide receivers right now are Amon-Ra St. Brown. I actually did not bench Garrett Wilson. Looks like I will be giving him one more try. Isaiah Likely at my tight end position. Leggett is my flex option, actually. I have the Pittsburgh defense, ironically enough, in this game. Hopefully they will have a couple of takeaways. And, of course, my man Dicker the kicker holding it down for me in the most valuable position in fantasy. I digress. In terms of Pickens and Freiermuth in this game, I feel like I said, some of their traits will be utilized, some of them will be underutilized in this game. For Pickens, let's hope that Russ has a couple deep shots in him. For Freiermuth, let's hope that Russell Wilson has a couple methodical drives and wants to utilize the tight end a little bit more. And so it's going to depend on how you truly feel about this matchup. Again, I feel like I'm sorry for copping out on you guys, but it's just the way this game is playing out. But at the end of the day, both of these guys have great traits that could really help the Steelers, most importantly, Russell Wilson in his first start. But you can also see a game where both of them, as Under said, I think they'll be all over Rodgers. I agree, and if you're talking about the Pittsburgh defense. But at the end of the day, the Pittsburgh offense is going to have to put up points. I am not too concerned with the Pittsburgh defense at all in this matchup. I think that they have enough talent in their front and in their secondary to hold it pretty well against what the Jets throw at them, because I really don't know what to think of this Jets offense going forward. But of course, to end off this segment, going back to Andre's comment about Najee Harris, I do think Najee Harris is the most likely start for anyone in this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. I think that he adds a lot of upside. He's going to be a big part in terms of ball retention for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And ultimately, I think that's the way to go if you want to work Russell Wilson into your offense, if you're Mike Tomlin. So we kind of had to do this off the cuff. I thank you all for your comments throughout. It really helped me out here. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments. It's going to be bizarre. It's going to be wacky. But to close out today's show and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, I have a very special new segment. My first ever fact or fiction segment to close out today's show. We'll be right back to talk about it right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of today and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And to close out the show today, I am introducing a new segment, my very first fact or fiction segment here. And I'm going to try and implement this into my show every week on Fridays. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. It's a little bit of a trial run here, but every week I thought it would be interesting to bring up some bold fantasy takes that might be in my mind. If you want to contribute as well, let me know. I will be certain to try and debunk each and every one of the statements you bring up to my attention if you are willing. But this segment is really just one that I wanted to have fun with because there are a lot of different takes that have come to my attention over the past couple of weeks or that I've thought of myself. But let me know what you think ultimately after this is all said and done. Without further ado, I picked 4 particularly intriguing, kind of controversial takes here from the fantasy football world. And not for nothing, they are very challenging now I'm looking at them. But just let me know, bear with me here. This is a new trial run here for the segment. But without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off with a team we're all too familiar with now after this episode, the Jets and their offense. And the statement being the Jets offense is kind of on the ropes. Now, originally I was going to say a little bit of a fact here because when this was written before Adams, I wasn't necessarily taking too much stock in the Buffalo game because I didn't see enough to truly convince me that the Jets offense has turned a page. And even after the Adams trade, I'm going to say I'm a little bit on the fence here, but I'm leaning towards fact. Because all of these weapons that you already had are now on the ropes. I'll kind of make it more succinct in that regard. Make it be more of certain players rather than the whole offense. Because there are some aspects of this offense that really will stick out a lot. Being, the Rodgers, Lazard, and Adams connection and how they look. But at the end of the day, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, guys of that nature are kind of going to create a little bit of tension here if there's no real rapport or chemistry developed between the hierarchies of this offense. And so that's why it's kind of a weird one, because you don't necessarily want to put all of the eggs in the panic basket, but I feel like this trade is going to do more harm than good in the long run. And not for nothing, I kind of feel like in a fantasy perspective, it's going to be brought to light way more than perhaps what people see in real life. Because in real life, you're going to get caught up in this trade. You're going to get caught up in the excitement of Rodgers having two of his guys, not one, but two of his guys on this team. And so I feel like from a fantasy perspective, it's really dire straits. And you might have to, as a lot of you commenting have already alluded to, sell high on some of these guys. That's just my first opinion. This one is really a kind of mind bender here. The Panthers offense could, in theory, be solid in fantasy. Now, hear me out here, because this one is also on the fence, and I was leaning towards fact. But I'll also kind of change my tune a little bit, change this kind of take here, to say that some of the Panthers offense could be solid in fantasy. And what I mean by this is, a lot of it comes down to, A, how long the Andy Dalton train can keep rolling, and B, how the Panthers now feel about Jonathan Brooks potentially coming back. Because if Jonathan Brooks comes into the equation for the Panthers, and I had a really nice segment before the season talking about him coming back in terms of his injury and fantasy implication wise as well, if you want to go check that out. But I feel like, this Panthers offense is kind of an offense that has bright spots, but it's heavily reliant on too much of one thing. And that is Andy Dalton continuing to succeed. Because, yes, Andy Dalton can rejuvenate an offense, but he can't redefine it. And going forward, I don't necessarily feel like Andy Dalton for the season is going to consistently look like the Andy Dalton who we've seen coming up in place of Bryce Young. And so guys like Deontay Johnson, guys like Chuba Hubbard will have a lot of value now. And those are the guys I'm really wanting to point out when I made this initial statement. But towards the end of the season, I feel like as the Panthers play more and more tough games in their schedule, there's going to be a glaring issue of wanting to rely on these guys, but finding that because of the fact the Panthers can't necessarily evolve outside of just relying on Dalton, then that will be to Hubbard and Johnson owners' detriments. So for now, I'm going to say semi-fact just because I like the Johnson Hubbards of the world, but it could lean a little bit more towards fiction by the end of the season. And right now, I am starting to want to lean a little bit more towards fiction, even though I am firmly sticking with quote-unquote semi-fact here. And the next one is also another Panthers one. Andy Dalton potentially being a top 5 fantasy QB this week. I went wild and wacky here for my first fact versus fiction segment. But there is a certain kind of truth to the sentiment here, right? Because the Panthers are playing the Commanders. And a lot of the questions will fall on the Commanders' defense's shoulders when we talk about the Washington Commanders as contender. I'm not worried about their offense in this game because, of course, the Panthers' defense is still one of the more atrocious ones in the league. But I feel like the Commanders' defense is one that, can keep them in games. But in games like this, against inferior competition, you're going to see them slip through the cracks. This kind of reminds me of the 2021 to 23 Seattle Seahawks defenses, where their offenses would do enough to keep them in games, but their defenses against inferior competition, would kind of drag them down a little bit. The reason why I went so bold to say Andy Dalton could be a top 5 fantasy QB this week is because of that Commanders defense and because of the high all his weapons are riding. But now I'm going to have to lean towards fiction just because Andy Dalton also has way too much pressure leading this offense. And not for nothing, I feel like Deontay Johnson is too specific of a receiver to really shine. And eventually, some of the pieces to this puzzle will stop falling apart. Eventually, we're going to start to see the loss of Adam Thielen for an extended period of time come into full effect in a game like this. And while I feel like Andy Dalton could have a good game still, I feel like he can take those opportunities that this Washington secondary will give him. I still feel like it's not going to be enough to be a top 5 performance. I could see potentially a top 15 performance for him, but not so gaudy to be in the top 5. And that's why I have to lean a little bit more towards fiction. But the last one I want to bring to your attention before we end the show, Vikings defense. Top defense overall, or top 5 of the week. And this one, I'm kind of saying fact on. And a lot of people might be surprised by that just because this has been their toughest assignment to date in terms of what the Detroit Lions offense presents. But I still like them a lot. And not for nothing, I feel like Brian Flores does more pre-snap to confuse opposing offenses than any other defensive coordinator in the league. And I feel like he's utilizing players who on different teams might have been seen more as role players to the best of his abilities and bringing out their best traits. And I love their offseason additions as well and how they've really impacted this team. I love Van Ginkel, I love Greener, and I love their depth in both the secondary and the linebacker position. They're just a team that, by hook or by crook, through the defensive side of the football, have enough physicality to really hurt good teams. We've seen it consistently, and like I said, toughest test to date for them this weekend. But I don't see why they can't potentially pull it off because of the fact that Brian Flores knows what he can get out of his defense, and he knows what these kind of role player types supplemented by his stars can do. And so that's why I'm really high on the Vikings defense this week, and that's why I'm stamping that take as a fact. Let me know what you think about this segment in the comments. It was really fun to do. But that has been this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in today and throughout the week. I do want to remind you yet again that if you want more exclusive content, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Also, check out my fellow podcasters. They're doing great things in their own right. As always, if you want to continue to interact with the show more directly throughout the live setting, Keep on using the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. Leave a tip or donation if you feel so inclined with the $ logo towards your screen in the comments section. Other than that, I've been Chris Shepard. We'll be back next week, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, as always, to talk more fantasy sports. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in yet again. Have a great week and enjoy your football this weekend. I am out.